Calvin Barkley had never been the type to cause trouble, and in most cases he avoided it altogether. He lived at the end of a quiet street on a parcel of land that jutted just slightly outside the uniform boundaries of the rest of the neighborhood. His home, a modest one-story brick house with ivy curling along the east-facing wall, had belonged to his family for generations. It was the kind of place where time seemed to pass more slowly, where the wind moved through the trees in a familiar rhythm, and where you could sit on the porch with a tin cup of fresh cider and feel like the world wasn't on fire for just a moment. That wasn't nothing. Not these days. Calvin knew how much he had to be grateful for, and though he didn't say much to his neighbors, he wasn't rude either. He kept to himself not because of any particular philosophy, but because he simply had enough to do. There were always things to fix, apples to gather, barrels to scrub, valves to check, and bottling to oversee. The apple tree in the center of his land wasn't just a tree. It was the tree. It stood in a slightly uneven circle of soil, its bark marked with the roughness of age, its branches wide and heavy, like the shoulders of an old worker who still kept lifting when no one asked him to. The tree bore a rare cultivar of apple, one that Calvin's late brother had grafted decades ago. Tart and floral, with notes that Calvin could still remember describing to buyers at the farmer's market. Like a cider from a mountain you've never climbed, sharp at the start and warm by the finish. The orchard had once been larger, but with development and time, only this one had remained. Calvin had fought to keep it. The tree had become more than a part of the land. It had become a part of his life's rhythm. The fruit it bore each year was the foundation of a small but beloved operation. Hand-pressed cider, aged in oak, unfiltered and rich. It wasn't just a business, it was tradition. It was continuity. It was a legacy still breathing through wood and root and hand-turned valves in the bottling shed. The cider was sold at select local establishments. Calvin never scaled up because he didn't want to compromise. He preferred slow things, real things. Honest work with an honest yield. That made it all the more strange when one morning, after a restless night of wind that rattled the edges of the roof but brought no storm, he stepped outside with his usual routine in hand, mug of tea in one, towel over the shoulder, and saw an empty patch of ground where the tree had stood for the last 45 years. At first, he simply froze. His brain refused to connect what his eyes saw with what he knew should have been there. There was no stump, not even shavings. Just churned earth. The hollow void in the ground was all that remained, a soft wound in the land. Calvin stepped forward slowly as though approaching a body at a crime scene and crouched beside the spot. His hand brushed through the upturned soil, still moist and loose. It had been dug cleanly by machine, with no care for the root system or surrounding ground. Someone had ripped it out with efficiency and indifference. There was a small plastic envelope tucked into the mailbox near his driveway. It was labeled Community Landscape Notice. Inside was a single printed sheet, not even folded, with a vague sentence about necessary land maintenance to uphold shared aesthetic values. It was unsigned. There was no specific explanation, no mention of authorization, no evidence of inspection, no documentation of complaint, and, most importantly, no contact from Calvin, who owned the land outright, independent of the residential street's governing board. That was intentional. His parcel had been deeded before the development of the larger tract, grandfathered out of the paperwork that so many others had unknowingly signed their freedoms into. He had no obligation to them, and they had no claim on his soil, or so he thought. Over the years, Calvin had kept a professional distance from the neighborhood board, what they liked to call their Landscape Community Council, though most people simply referred to it as the committee, or those clipboard people. He'd attended a meeting once, long ago, out of curiosity. What he found were power-hungry homeowners who mistook aesthetic control for civic duty. Their concerns were about uniform hedges, matching mailbox colors, curb strip consistency. They spoke of community tone and visual equity. Calvin had said nothing that day. He had stood in the back, arms crossed, and left without saying goodbye. Since then, the relationship had remained one of unspoken agreement. He stayed out of their affairs, and they stayed out of his. That balance, it now seemed, had been shattered. By noon, Calvin had called every number he could think of. The county land office had no record of an authorized removal. The environmental department had no reports of diseased trees in his area. The sheriff's office informed him politely that civil landscape disputes fall outside our enforcement scope. The council's main line went to voicemail. No one called back. It wasn't until the following morning that he saw her. Karen Little, head of the neighborhood council, standing at the edge of the grass across from his fence, sipping coffee from a ceramic cup as if she hadn't personally violated every boundary that property ownership implied. She wore pale slacks, beige heels, and a white button-up shirt so stiff it seemed engineered. Calvin walked down his driveway calmly, hands at his sides, every step deliberate. She didn't flinch as he approached. Instead, she offered a smile he would have called diplomatic if it hadn't radiated condescension. That tree was encroaching on shared visual space, she said before he even asked the question. You should have received the notice. Calvin didn't answer immediately. He looked past her to the empty patch in his yard, and then back to her slowly. That was a heritage tree, he said. His voice was calm, but the weight in it was unmistakable. Karen tilted her head as if feigning sympathy. We tried to be as respectful as possible, she said, but we've had complaints. You know how these things go. Property values, community cohesion, all that. You removed it without speaking to me, Calvin said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. It was technically over the community line, she said, a legal phrase she clearly didn't understand. And besides, it was aging. We couldn't risk it falling. It was healthy, he replied, and on my land. She shrugged. Sometimes personal spaces have to yield to collective needs. That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of overreach, no recognition of harm done. Calvin turned around and walked back to his house without another word. He went to the shed, checked the remaining barrels, and sat on the concrete floor for a long time. He thought about how his brother had spent an entire year cultivating the graft, how his father had built the fence around that tree with his own hands, how the soil beneath it had never known a shovel that didn't belong to this family. He thought about every bottle of cider poured, every conversation started with, "You have to try this," every moment of peace earned through labor. And then he stood up. Something had changed. And if they thought they could make it right with paper notices and phony concern, they hadn't understood what they had really cut down. Calvin didn't sleep much that night. The silence in his home was heavier than usual, dense and unmoving, like the air before a summer storm that never quite comes. He sat in his workshop well past midnight, surrounded by barrels, old hand tools, notebooks filled with fermentation logs, and an unopened bottle of cider from the year his brother had died. The bottle sat on the shelf like a sealed memory, dust lining its shoulders, label faded, wax cap still intact. He didn't touch it. Instead, he stared at the outline of the tree in the photograph nailed above his workbench. Taken in the fall of 2008, it showed the tree at full bloom, fiery red against the pale blue sky, with Calvin and his brother standing under it, sleeves rolled up, both holding crates of apples. It wasn't nostalgia that hurt. It was violation. The realization that someone had walked onto his property, severed his history from the ground, and walked away without consequence, expecting silence in return. That expectation would prove foolish. At dawn, Calvin loaded his truck with the documentation he'd gathered over the years. Copies of his property survey, boundary line confirmations, a certified arborist report from 2 years prior affirming the tree's health, and photographs clearly, showing the tree fully within his lot. He had kept these records not out of paranoia, but because he understood how easily people dismissed things they didn't care about. Calvin believed in having the proof ready, not because he wanted to argue, but because some people only spoke the language of paper. He drove to the county recorder's office first, where he requested a full title history of his land and reviewed the documents with the clerk. As expected, his parcel was not listed under any jurisdictional obligation to the neighborhood association. The clerk even highlighted the clause on the original deed that specifically exempted his lot from inclusion in the post-development maintenance district formed 10 years after the house was built. It was all there, black and white, undeniable. He moved next to the office of the Municipal Code Enforcement Division. There, he submitted a formal complaint citing unauthorized trespass, destruction of private property, and removal of registered flora without consent or permit. The woman at the desk took the paperwork with a rehearsed nod, but when he mentioned the name of the council chair, Karen Little, her brow arched ever so slightly. "You're not the first," she said under her breath almost to herself. When Calvin asked what she meant, she simply smiled tightly and said, "We'll investigate and contact you if we need further information." That was all. No assurances, no clear next steps, just protocol. Calvin knew enough not to expect results from that avenue alone, but he also knew the value of having an official paper trail. He made copies of every form submitted, every timestamp and reference number. Back at home, he placed calls to 2 tree preservation nonprofits. One of them, a regional chapter focused on heritage cultivars, confirmed that his particular apple tree had been cataloged in a 1990 study as a hybrid graft, known for its resilience and distinct sugar structure. The woman on the phone sounded almost horrified when he described how it had been removed. She asked if she could send someone to assess the site and file a report. Calvin agreed. She arrived that same afternoon, clipboard in hand, and walked the yard slowly, measuring the remaining root structure, taking photos, and making quiet notes. When she finished, she shook Calvin's hand firmly and said, "This wasn't pruning. This was an excavation. Whoever did this didn't care what they were removing." Meanwhile, no one from the council responded to his calls or emails. Karen, as always, remained out of reach, her position behind a layer of coordinators and passive gatekeepers. So, Calvin changed his approach. He contacted a local attorney, not a crusading hero or retired judge, just a man named Harris Burke who specialized in land use and agricultural protections. Calvin didn't seek revenge, only recognition. He wanted it on the record that what had been done was illegal, unjustified, and that it would not be allowed to slide into silence. Burke reviewed the documentation, the survey maps, the letters from the tree organizations, and the deed exemption clause, then leaned back in his chair, adjusted his glasses, and said, "They're betting you won't push back. That's all this is. They think people like you won't take it to court." Calvin didn't respond to that directly. He didn't have to. The next day, Burke drafted a cease and desist letter to the neighborhood council, demanding written acknowledgement of wrongdoing and full disclosure of who ordered the removal. It was sent by courier with return receipt required. 48 hours passed, then 72. Still no reply. And then came the second blow, delivered not in the form of a letter or a voicemail, but by a change in how people looked at him. He was in town collecting bottling supplies when he noticed it first. At the hardware store, 2 regulars whom he'd shared coffee with before avoided eye contact. A third man, someone he didn't know well but who had once praised his cider publicly, now muttered something under his breath as Calvin passed in the aisle. It wasn't until later that afternoon, while checking his email at the library's public computer terminal, that he saw it. A message forwarded to him by an old friend on the neighborhood's email list. The subject line read, "Disruption of Community Cohesion. Aggressor Alert." The email, signed by Karen Little and forwarded from the council's mailing address, contained a carefully worded accusation that a local resident had engaged in hostile correspondence, distributed misleading legal threats, and endangered volunteer staff through intimidating rhetoric. It didn't mention Calvin by name, but it didn't have to. The timeline and references were clear. He had been painted as a liability, not just a nuisance, but a destabilizing force. This was no longer about a tree. This was about rewriting the narrative. Later that night, as he walked the perimeter of his property, he found a small plastic stake hammered into the soil near the back of his lot. It was marked with survey tape and a printed tag, "Pending Zone Review." Calvin yanked it out with one motion, brought it to his workshop, and placed it next to the piece of root he'd salvaged from the tree. He stared at the two side by side for a long while. They were escalating. Quietly, subtly, but deliberately. What began as overreach had turned into encroachment. They were laying the groundwork to claim control, through implication, through slow erosion of boundaries, through bureaucratic paper trails no one paid attention to until it was too late. But Calvin was paying attention now. He understood what they were doing, and worse, he understood how many times they'd done it before. Not just to him, but to others who lacked the time, the will, or the clarity to fight back. Most people folded under pressure. They chose peace over conflict, especially when the conflict was designed to wear them down piece by piece, hour by hour, form by form. That was the strategy. Not to win through force, but through fatigue. Calvin, however, had more stamina than they expected. His work had made him patient, methodical, and accustomed to cycles that took time. Fermentation didn't happen overnight. He knew how to wait, but he also knew how to act. Not emotionally, not destructively, but strategically. He wasn't a man looking for a fight, but he wasn't afraid of one either. And this was now a fight. Calvin knew better than to respond with anger, at least not in the way they might expect. He'd seen how people were baited, first with an intrusion, then with silence, then with provocation. If you reacted too fast or too loud, they'd call you irrational, make you the problem, and wrap it in enough paper and passive aggression that no one on the outside would ever see what had started it. But Calvin had no intention of reacting. He intended to respond. And there's a world of difference between the two. The next morning, while the town was just beginning to hum with movement, Calvin returned to the county planning office. Not the main desk, but the building code annex. He met with the supervisor and submitted a formal inquiry regarding the zoning tag he had found staked into his land. The supervisor, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a coffee-stained shirt, pulled up the records and frowned. There had been no application logged, no pending reviews. The tag, as far as their system showed, was unauthorized. When Calvin showed him a photo of the stake, the man squinted at the label and muttered, "That's not one of ours." He printed out a certificate stating no official zoning actions had been filed for Calvin's address and signed it. It wasn't much, but it was something real, and Calvin folded the paper into his pocket like a receipt from a battle narrowly avoided. That afternoon, he began contacting suppliers, not for cider, but for trees. It took half a dozen calls before he found what he was looking for. A heritage orchard in the next state over that specialized in obscure grafts and legacy varietals. They had a handful of saplings grafted from the same line as the tree Calvin had lost. Not identical, of course, but as close as possible. He ordered 12 and paid in full. Delivery was scheduled for 2 weeks later. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. There would be a time for replanting, but first he needed to make a statement. He took the last batch of cider bottled before the tree was cut down. 26 bottles in total, labeled by hand, each bearing the mark of the apple that would never fruit again, and boxed them with clean straw and parchment. He placed them in the back of his truck and drove to the community center, where the council was holding one of their open neighbor nights. These were usually small affairs, filled with casual pleasantries, baked goods, and council members making friendly overtures under the fluorescent charm of folding tables. Calvin arrived quietly, parked a block away, and walked in with his crates just before the event was scheduled to begin. He set them down on the refreshments table with a note. From the last harvest of the tree that stood. Then he turned and left without a word. The gesture created ripples. Some neighbors recognized the label immediately. Others didn't connect it until later, when someone posted a photo of the display to the community forum with a caption that simply read, "Was this from the tree they removed?" The discussion that followed was cautious, tentative. People didn't want to take sides, not yet, but doubt had been introduced, and once doubt entered a room, it had a way of lingering. That same night, Calvin received an email from a neighbor he barely knew, a woman named Margaret whose backyard faced his. She wrote that she had seen workers behind his fence 3 days before the tree vanished. 2 men in plain blue uniforms with an unmarked white van, cutting branches and digging. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. They looked official. Now, she wasn't so sure. With her permission, Calvin forwarded that email to Harris Burke, his attorney, who appended it to the ongoing file. By the end of the week, Burke had drafted a formal demand for the council to disclose all subcontractor activities conducted within a 1-block radius of Calvin's property for the preceding 30 days. They refused, citing procedural confidentiality. Burke filed a subpoena. That, at least, would take longer to ignore. In the meantime, Calvin began preparing the land for new planting, quietly, without spectacle. He rented a rotary tiller and worked the soil where the tree had stood, clearing the bed, layering compost, mapping root channels. It was hard work, but familiar, and it gave him something to focus on. The sweat was honest, and it pushed out the weight of helplessness. He didn't speak to anyone while he worked. He didn't need to. Then, one morning, he awoke to find that someone had left a note pinned to his fence. No envelope, just a sheet folded and stabbed through with a roofing nail. The handwriting was printed in thick marker, uneven and urgent. "Stop dividing the neighborhood. Let it go." There was no signature, no return address, just ink and metal and intent. Calvin pulled it from the wood and held it in his hand for a long moment. The note didn't scare him. It clarified things. Someone, maybe several people, had started to feel uncomfortable. That was good. Comfort was a luxury he no longer had, and he didn't see why they should be exempt. He started showing up at council meetings, not to speak, but to listen. He'd sit in the back, arms folded, eyes steady, as Karen and her allies discussed shrub height and mail slot styles, pretending nothing had happened. Occasionally, someone would glance at him. Karen never did. Not once. She avoided eye contact with the precision of a professional, but her shoulders were tighter now, her tone clipped, her smiles more forced. Calvin said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Then came the garbage incident. One morning, Calvin found his trash bins overturned in the street, contents scattered across the curb, sticky cider pulp mixing with broken glass and cardboard. It wasn't the wind. The bins were heavy. They had been dragged and tipped deliberately. He cleaned it without complaint but installed a motion-activated camera near the driveway that afternoon. Not out of fear, out of pattern recognition. People escalate when they feel cornered, and Calvin knew that whoever had cut down his tree wasn't ready for what came next. A few days later, he noticed something stranger. The council had scheduled a new maintenance initiative for the street. Routine landscaping, they said, targeting overgrown foliage and unregistered plantings. Flyers were posted on mailboxes, and workers began appearing near yards in reflective vests. Calvin watched them carefully. They never crossed onto his property again, but they circled. They lingered near the fence line. One of them made a point of staring at his front porch before turning away. That evening, he spoke with Burke about escalation. Burke advised caution, but also gave Calvin something new, a set of legal warning signs that could be posted along the perimeter of his lot, backed by county code citations and trespass penalties. Calvin mounted them the next morning, hammered into posts at each corner of the yard. The language was dry, formal, but unmistakable. Anyone stepping past that fence now did so at their own risk. That same day, Calvin submitted a formal request to the sheriff's office for a neighborhood patrol, citing documented cases of boundary disputes, property damage, and implied threats. He didn't expect them to come often, but it put his name in their rotation. It forced the situation into the system. Still, the air around his property felt different now. It wasn't just tension. It was isolation. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Eyes followed him from windows. The neighbor kids no longer biked near his driveway. He knew what they were doing. They were trying to socially quarantine him, to starve his resolve through distance. But Calvin had lived through worse things than cold shoulders. He had watched his brother die in a hospital bed without ever getting to taste the cider they'd spent years refining. He had lost friends to time, illness, and indifference. Compared to that, petty gossip and manufactured unease were nothing. Late one night, sitting in his workshop with the fan humming and the air thick with fermentation, he uncorked one of the last bottles from the old tree and poured it into a chipped glass. He took a sip. It was perfect. Deep and dry, with a finish that lingered like a memory just out of reach. He set the glass down and stared at the sapling in the corner, still wrapped in burlap, waiting for the right moment to be planted. It would take years to bear fruit, but it would grow. 2 weeks passed, and the 12 saplings arrived just after sunrise on a damp Tuesday morning. They came bundled in straw and burlap, stacked gently in the back of a temperature-controlled delivery truck, their graft points still bandaged and soil damp with cold storage. Calvin had prepared the ground carefully, each planting spot measured, staked, and tilled, with compost mixed deep into the beds and rain barrels set out in advance for non-chlorinated watering. He had not told anyone they were coming, but by the time he unloaded the last tree, 2 neighbors had stopped to watch from across the street, saying nothing, pretending to be checking mail or adjusting lawn sprinklers. He ignored them. He worked with steady hands, planting each tree along the fence line on the side that faced the road, a living barrier that would one day bloom in defiance. He wasn't planting a new orchard, not exactly. It was a border, a statement, a line they could see but would never again be allowed to cross. By that evening, the trees were in the ground, watered, supported by cedar stakes, and wrapped against wind. Calvin stood among them as the sky shifted from gray to bruised purple, the sun disappearing behind the rows of roofs that now boxed in the horizon. He could already see the shape of it, what they'd look like when they grew tall enough to shade the road, when their blossoms replaced the council's ornamental bushes as the first sign of spring. It wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. The next day, a letter arrived, not from the council directly, but from a third-party mediation firm retained on their behalf. It was formal, stiff, full of clipped legalese that only said something when it was trying very hard to say nothing. It claimed that recent developments on Calvin's property had raised community-wide concerns, particularly regarding safety, visibility, and potential encroachment. The letter invited Calvin to attend a facilitated mediation session, not as an adversary, but as a valued member of the community with a shared interest in harmony. The date was set for the following Friday. Attendance was, as they phrased it, strongly recommended to prevent escalation. Calvin showed the letter to Harris Burke, who read it slowly, lips pressed thin. "They're not trying to solve this," Burke said. "They're trying to reframe it. They want a record showing they offered dialogue, so if you go public or pursue legal action, they can claim you refused to cooperate." He advised Calvin to attend, but to say as little as possible, and to record everything. The mediation was held in a rental office in a nearby business park, a sterile room with plastic chairs and motivational posters curling at the edges. Karen Little was already there when Calvin arrived, seated beside a younger man in a crisp blazer who introduced himself as the council's legal consultant. The mediator, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and a voice like a train station announcement, began with practiced neutrality. Calvin said nothing for the first 15 minutes. He listened. He watched Karen as she smiled, spoke in vague terms about misunderstandings, community cohesion, and how landscape identity was crucial to neighborhood morale. She never acknowledged the tree. She never used the word cut or remove. Instead, she called it an overgrowth intervention. It wasn't just evasive, it was strategic. When Calvin finally did speak, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for apologies. He simply stated, with clarity and documented evidence, that his tree was destroyed without notice, his property boundaries had been repeatedly violated, and that every action taken since had only compounded the initial offense. He ended by sliding a printed copy of the exemption clause from his deed across the table, highlighting in yellow the line that placed his land outside the council's authority. The consultant looked uncomfortable. The mediator asked if anyone wanted to request an adjournment to review the document. Karen declined. "We're not here to litigate," she said. "We're here to restore peace." Calvin let that sit in the air for a moment before replying, "There's no peace without accountability." The session ended without agreement, but that had never been the goal. 2 days later, the council issued a community bulletin stating that an unnamed resident had declined resolution, and that the board would be pursuing alternative channels to ensure public harmony and aesthetic continuity. The language was vague, enough to avoid legal risk but pointed enough to cast suspicion. Calvin didn't respond. He didn't need to. The bulletin was immediately followed by a new surge of council-led activity, sudden inspections of trash can placements, parking citations, and door tags about lawn watering schedules. None of it stuck. Calvin followed all ordinances, but it was clear they were trying to provoke him. He didn't bite. Then something changed. A second stake appeared near his driveway. Not a zoning tag this time, but a marker labeled Utility Access Point. Calvin contacted the city utilities department, who confirmed they had not sent any crews, had no scheduled maintenance in his area, and were unaware of any service orders involving his address. Someone was forging access claims. Someone wanted to establish a paper trail that would later justify action. Burke began drafting a restraining order request against any future activity by council subcontractors within Calvin's boundaries, but the process would take time. Calvin decided to accelerate his own timeline. He spent the next 3 evenings modifying the old delivery truck he used for transporting barrels. It was a relic, mid-90s, dented, but reliable. He reinforced the interior with stabilizing racks, secured 2 full fermentation barrels with pressure-locking valves, and routed a drainage hose from the bottom of one out through the side panel. The cider inside was strong halfway through fermentation, rich with yeasts and sugar, sticky, acidic, and potent enough to kill a lawn outright if left to soak. He didn't tell anyone what he was planning. He didn't write a manifesto or post online or send threats. That wasn't the point. It wasn't about rage. It was about demonstration, of damage, of disregard, of what it felt like to have something permanent and growing be undone overnight without a second thought. At precisely 5 in the morning, before the street had woken, he drove the truck to the front lawn of the council's administrative building, technically a converted model home with landscaped hedges and a pristine walkway. He parked it just beyond the curb, centered on the lawn, engine off, windows rolled down. Then he pulled the lever that opened the drainage valve. It wasn't dramatic. There was no fountain or gushing river, just a slow, steady flow of golden liquid seeping into the soil, into the roots of their imported grass, into the foundation of everything they claimed to care about. Then he walked away. Calvin didn't look back at the building as he walked away. He didn't need to. The cider would do its work. It wasn't meant as a spectacle. It was a message. Not for the public, not for social media, but for the council itself. It was a direct reply in the same language they had used. Action, without warning, without permission, and without the courtesy of explanation. He drove back to his house in the early light, the roads empty, the silence deep. By the time most of the neighborhood was beginning to stir, he had already changed clothes, put on a pot of coffee, and returned to his usual morning tasks as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But something had changed. By noon, a maintenance crew had arrived at the council building, and by the end of the day, the entire front lawn had been dug up and roped off with plastic barriers. No formal statement was issued, but word spread quickly. Most residents assumed a pipe had burst or that some chemical had been spilled. The smell of fermenting cider lingered faintly in the air for days, sweet and sour and impossible to ignore. But no one confronted Calvin. Not publicly, not directly. The council, for all its confidence in forms and meetings, wasn't prepared for asymmetrical retaliation. They didn't know how to handle unpredictability, and that made Calvin dangerous in a way they hadn't anticipated. Still, retaliation came, just not in the form of confrontation. Instead, it arrived by mail, wrapped in bureaucracy. 2 days later, Calvin received a formal letter from a law firm retained by the council, accusing him of willful damage to community property and demanding immediate restitution for landscaping repairs, potential structural harm, and reputational damage to the association. The figure listed was absurd, nearly $10,000 for grass, shrubbery, and nuisance restoration. Calvin handed the letter to Burke without comment. Burke skimmed it, muttered something under his breath, and said, "This is pressure, not litigation. Posturing. They know they'd lose if they actually filed." Still, he prepared a response, a formal denial, with supporting evidence that the land in question was not public but held in trust by the council, with no municipal claim. The letter was returned with a counter-demand for mediation. Burke declined, and Calvin authorized a conditional counterclaim. If they pressed forward, he would file suit for trespass, unauthorized removal of botanical heritage, and harassment. The situation was now fully legal. No more passive notices, no more veiled threats through flyers or parking citations. Calvin's name was entered into official filings, his claim assigned a civil case number, and preliminary hearings scheduled. This should have marked the end of petty retaliation. But the council didn't retreat. They diversified. Calvin began receiving sudden visits from county inspectors. A fire marshal stopped by to ask about his water heater. A health inspector claimed to be following up on a report of improper fermentation storage. A zoning officer knocked at 8 in the morning to measure his garage setbacks. Each time, Calvin produced documentation, permits, safety certifications, all valid, all current. None of the officials were aggressive, most of them seemed embarrassed. One quietly admitted that an anonymous complaint had triggered the inspection. When Calvin asked how many anonymous complaints it took to initiate a visit, the man hesitated before saying, "More than one." Usually several, they were coordinating an indirect siege. Not one big push, but 1,000 small ones, each designed to wear him down, exhaust his patience, drain his resources. But Calvin didn't flinch. He documented everything. He logged the time and date of each visit, took notes, photographed all correspondences, and sent copies to Burke, who was now assembling a file thick enough to tip a bookshelf. The lawyer advised him to stay the course. "They're escalating because you didn't back down. That's all this is. They want you to either break or snap. If you snap, they win. If you break, they win. So don't do either." Calvin didn't. Instead, he expanded his planting. He took 5 of the remaining saplings and dug beds for them along the interior fence line, not visible from the road, just for himself. He built a small trellis structure over each to support growth through the first winter and began brewing compost tea for weekly feedings. He cleaned the gutters, repainted the shed, and repaired a cracked hose spigot near the western edge of the property. The work grounded him, gave rhythm to days that might otherwise be consumed by letters and legalese. He refused to let the conflict define his life. It would occupy space, yes, but it wouldn't become the whole shape of things. Still, he remained alert, and it was a good thing he did. One night, near midnight, motion lights in the side yard triggered. Calvin, already lightly sleeping, rose quickly, slipped on his boots, and stepped outside with a flashlight. He moved silently, listening. Near the back fence, he found footprints in the freshly watered soil, leading to the base of the newest sapling. The tree was intact, but a small flag had been placed in the ground next to it. It was bright orange and bore a symbol indicating underground utility lines. Calvin recognized it immediately, standard marker used during mapping procedures. Except he hadn't called for any mapping, and the tree was nowhere near any registered lines. He left the flag in place, went back inside, and called Burke the next morning. The lawyer advised filing a report with the sheriff's department, not as a criminal complaint but as an incident record. Calvin complied. A deputy visited later that day, took notes, and filed the report. Calvin didn't expect follow-up, but it was another entry in the growing ledger. The council was now probing, testing what they could get away with under darkness, how far they could push the boundary without triggering retaliation. Calvin responded by installing additional floodlights, angled motion sensors, and a timed irrigation cycle designed to activate unpredictably during night hours. He didn't want a confrontation. He wanted deterrence, and he made sure they knew it. Then came the break. It started innocuously with an internal leak, an email thread forwarded anonymously to Burke's office. The source was unclear, the metadata stripped, but the content was damning. It showed communications between Karen Little and several council members discussing Calvin's property as a long-term integration target and referencing prior unauthorized actions as precedent. One email read, "If we normalize small adjustments." Now, any pushback later will seem exaggerated. Another referenced the tree removal directly. We had to set the tone. That tree was never part of the street plan. Burke forwarded the thread to Calvin, along with a single-line message. "We have them." With those emails, everything changed. Burke filed a motion to amend the civil case, attaching the messages as evidence of intent, collusion, and targeted harassment. He also contacted a local judge with a request for expedited injunction to halt any further physical action against Calvin's property pending resolution of the case. The injunction was granted. The council panicked. Within days, they issued a letter, this time signed by Karen directly, claiming unfortunate misunderstandings and proposing a private settlement. Burke advised rejecting it. They don't want to lose in court, but you don't need to settle. You're winning. Calvin didn't reply to the letter. He focused on preparing the yard for winter, mulching the saplings, reinforcing their stakes, and adding windbreaks made from scrap fencing. But he wasn't finished. At the next council meeting, open to the public as required by charter, Calvin appeared at the door just as proceedings began. He didn't enter immediately. Instead, he wheeled in a dolly carrying a single fermentation barrel, sealed, aged, and labeled. Final batch, from the tree you removed. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The entire room fell silent as he placed the barrel gently in the center of the room, tipped it slightly on its side, and rolled it into position. Then he left. That night, a neighbor left a note on his door. It was handwritten, unsigned, and said only, "You're right. We see it now." For the first time since the tree was cut down, Calvin smiled. Calvin didn't attend the next hearing in person. Burke handled it entirely, presenting the leaked emails, documented inspections, and the compiled timeline of events that painted a methodical picture of harassment, property interference, and strategic boundary manipulation by the council. It wasn't a dramatic court scene. There was no shouting, no theatrics. It was quiet, procedural, and deeply effective. The judge, an older man with a history in property law, listened without interruption, read through the supporting evidence carefully, and finally issued a temporary injunction with full effect. No member of the neighborhood council, its affiliates, or any subcontractor acting under its direction was permitted to approach, inspect, enter, or interfere with Calvin Barkley's property under any circumstances until the matter was resolved by formal decision. The language was clear, the tone direct. It wasn't just a pause, it was a restraint, and it carried weight. Karen's legal team attempted to argue for reconsideration, citing community cohesion and collective property management as justification, but it fell flat. The judge was unmoved. He referenced the exemption clause on Calvin's deed and pointed out, on record, that no legal claim had ever been made on the tree, nor had any boundary adjustment been filed through proper channels. In short, the council had acted unilaterally, and now they were being held accountable. Word of the ruling spread quickly through the neighborhood. Not officially, there were no emails, no flyers, but through whispers, glances, conversations exchanged over hedges and trash bins. Something had shifted. Calvin could feel it, not in grand gestures, but in the way people moved around him. More than a few neighbors nodded when he passed, some cautiously, others with what looked like silent respect. Even the air felt less heavy. The sense of siege was fading, replaced by something that resembled, if not support, then at least acknowledgement. But Karen wasn't done. The board met in private, bypassing the usual open forum, and within days issued an internal policy update, an emergency clause that, while not enforceable on Calvin's land, proposed new rules for adjacent properties regarding line-of-sight visual, harmony, and shared curb appeal responsibilities. It was a last-ditch effort to isolate him again, to pressure those living near him into treating his yard, his trees, his very presence as a violation of aesthetic order. And this time, it backfired. One of the neighboring families, a couple named Richards with 2 teenage sons, sent a letter to the council declining to comply. In it, they cited the excessive nature of the new rules, the damage done to Calvin's property, and their refusal to participate in a retaliatory campaign against a private citizen. The letter leaked. Others followed. A small group of residents began quietly discussing a petition to recall the current council leadership, citing misuse of funds, unauthorized actions, and abuse of administrative tools for personal agendas. Calvin didn't participate in the effort. He wasn't interested in revenge or politics. His goal had always been simple: to be left alone and to protect what mattered. In the midst of all this, something unexpected happened. A package arrived at Calvin's door. It was small, square, and unmarked. Inside was a sealed envelope containing a formal letter on county letterhead from the Department of Agricultural Heritage and Preservation. The letter informed him that, following review of his submitted materials and the subsequent investigation, his former apple tree had been reclassified as a significant local botanical specimen, part of a limited genetic line with historical, agricultural value. A grant had been approved to support preservation and replanting of such trees. Enclosed was a certificate, signed and stamped, recognizing his late brother's graft as a unique cultivar. There was no money attached, just a recognition, a formal acknowledgement that what had been destroyed was irreplaceable. Calvin held the certificate for a long time. Not for pride, not for victory, but for the quiet realization that something true had been preserved, even if only in name and memory. He framed it and hung it above his workbench, beside the old photo of him and his brother beneath the original tree. That same week, the soil test results came back from the front lawn of the council's building. The cider had soaked deep, and the sugar levels had triggered a fungal bloom. The soil was now considered biologically volatile, unfit for replanting without full treatment. The maintenance contractor refused to touch it. Their insurance wouldn't cover fermentation-related contamination. In a final insult, the lawn had to be covered with canvas and gravel to prevent spore spread. The front of the council's building now looked like an abandoned lot. Calvin didn't gloat. He didn't speak of it to anyone. But one morning, early, before the sun was up, he walked past the building and placed a single apple on the gravel, deep red from the last crate he'd stored. He left it there, centered, upright like a monument. The silence that followed wasn't absence, it was respect. The conflict had reached its peak, and now it was receding. Not through surrender or public apology, but through weight. The weight of truth, evidence, time, and roots that had gone deeper than they'd imagined. Calvin returned to his work. He bottled a new batch, marked the corks with a copper seal, his brother's initials, and delivered a case to the bar that had sold their first cider years ago. He said little, just smiled and passed over the box, a quiet thank you shared between people who understood legacy. In his yard, the saplings held fast, green and budding despite the cooling air. The wind moved through them like a song he almost remembered, and though the original tree was gone, its line lived on, not in defiance but in continuation. Calvin didn't think of it as winning. He thought of it as restoring something honest that should never have been broken. The frost came early that year, creeping in along the roof lines and softening the ground before the leaves had fully turned. Calvin walked his property before sunrise each morning, inspecting the saplings for stress, checking the mulch for moisture, wrapping twine tighter where needed. He moved without hurry but with precision, each gesture a quiet promise to the future. The air had the taste of change, metallic and faintly electric, like a season waiting to shift. It had been weeks since the last formal letter arrived from the council. No citations, no demands, no mediators. Their silence was its own kind of capitulation. The hearings were still pending, and the recall petition had officially surpassed the signature threshold, forcing a vote that would take place before the end of the year. Karen's name was still on the list, but her influence had withered. The gravel lot in front of the council building stood untouched, and the canvas cover had begun to peel at the edges, fluttering in the wind like a shroud. No one talked about replacing it. No one had the will. Calvin didn't speak of it either. He accepted the quiet the way a farmer accepts the end of a storm, not with celebration, but with the return to work. He wasn't interested in parading his resolve. He was interested in rebuilding what mattered. One morning, he visited the regional nursery that had shipped the original replacement saplings. The owner, a woman with sharp eyes and hands hardened by soil, recognized him immediately. She brought out 2 crates of seedlings, untagged, unadvertised, still in trial cultivation. "They're not for sale," she said. "But if you want them, they're yours. I read about what happened." Calvin didn't ask how she'd heard. News like that traveled, not through media or gossip, but through people who worked the land, who understood what it meant to lose something alive. He planted those seedlings in the back corner of the yard, where no one could see them from the road. They were his, and his alone. A quiet trust placed in time. He didn't need them to grow quickly. He only needed them to begin. A week before the recall vote, a council member unexpectedly stepped down. No explanation, no replacement named. The timing was obvious. The momentum had shifted too far to reverse. On the day of the vote, Calvin went about his business as usual, bottling cider, checking pressure valves, adjusting temperatures in the shed. He didn't go to the polling center, though he could have. His vote wasn't needed. He had already cast it, months ago, with roots and silence and barrels and the quiet refusal to bend. By evening, the results were public. The vote had passed. The council was dissolved pending re-election. Karen's tenure ended not with a resignation or a final word, but with her absence from the announcement. She simply didn't appear. The new interim board was led by a local teacher, a man Calvin had once seen organizing a charity drive outside the library. He stopped by one morning, walking the line of saplings along the road, not with a clipboard, but with a mug of coffee and hands in his jacket pockets. They didn't speak long, just long enough for him to say, "I'm not here to fix what happened, just to make sure it doesn't happen again." Calvin nodded once and went back to pruning. That was all the closure he needed. As winter settled in, the cider house grew cold. The barrels slowed their bubbling, and the air took on that stillness only found in places that know how to wait. Calvin worked with fewer daylight hours, but more purpose. The new labels bore no name, no branding, just a stamped image of a tree with a single root exposed, curling like a question. He didn't advertise.